Thanks so much for inviting me. This has been a topic on my mind for a number of years, and I've been a little too lazy to kind of really try to shape it. I tried once to write a paper about it, but I've been thinking a lot about it. And my background in behavioral ecology has always seduced me with ecological metaphors. So this is an attempt to take a project that I've been privy to be involved in for 5 years, even though it's a 10-year project, to give some of my observations on it. So I'll just dive in. So I'm going to say kind of how I think of the mid-level knowledge of strong concepts, and then I'll talk a little bit about ecological metaphors. And I'm actually going to talk about the Ruby project, and I'll try to make it relevant to 3 different types of niches that I see. One is a research group, the other is a research site, and the other is a research network. And then I'll try to make some conclusions. So bear with me, because I'm giving such a broad perspective that it probably won't be too satisfying, won't be satisfying enough in terms of the details of each one, but I hope that the gist will come through. So I really like the idea of mid-level knowledge. I think I generally I like abstractions, so this suits me very well as a way to organize my thinking and generate new ideas. And when I think of mid-level knowledge and strong concepts, I think a lot that it mostly comes across as metaphors. And I just wanted to bring a few quotes. One is by Rosenbluth and Wiener. Those are the people that were really influential at the beginning of the cybernetics movement. And they said the price of metaphor is eternal vigilance. So you choose a metaphor, but then you have to keep track all the time that you're not using it, overusing it, or overextending it. And then some people who kind of make specifically more to design. They're talking about how it can be used to engage the design process. And being in HRI for a while, I've been around a lot, and I've tried to engage a lot, because I'm a primatologist, to think of human-robot interactions in terms of the relationship. And I think we've gone from master-slave to thinking about human-robot interaction as social contract, collaboration, cooperation, joint attention, shared control. We talk a lot about companionship now. But in this talk, I'm trying more to, somehow, oh, there, okay, to use ecological metaphors. And when people think about ecological metaphors in relation to cognitive science or design, they usually think about ecological perception or ecological psychology. That was the work of both J.J. and E.J. Gibson. They were husband and wife. But in fact, and sometimes people think that ecological psychology is enough of a thing, but actually J.J. Gibson considered it more as a metaphor. And what he was very curious about is the relationship between the outside world and how we understand it. And he had this idea that of affordances that is very common to use in design. So I like their work. I'm very enamored with Richard Lewontin, which I think is one of the most smart thinkers about ecology and also the extension of it to other domains. And he wrote a lot of different books, but this book is a really small book, and it's just beautifully written. And he basically takes the idea and he says, if you want to understand living systems, you have to understand gene, organism, and environment. And rather than thinking of the double helix, he calls it a triple helix, because we usually we have a tendency to think just about genotype and phenotype, and we don't think enough about environment. So he brings that forward. And the important things to think about living systems is that they're open systems, they're heterogeneous components, And the idea in Darwin evolutionary theory that an organism is adapting to a niche seems a lot of times like the niche is a static thing, the environment is static, and the organism is adapting to it, where in fact there is always a dynamic, and there isn't such a thing as an empty niche that then you throw an organism into. And I think probably the same case, we can easily find ways to extend that to the way we think about robotics. But the idea of niche construction in more recent years, Kevin Leyland is probably, he's in the University of St. Andrews, is probably one of the proponents of kind of pushing this idea and organizing a lot of work around it. And more in ecology and ecosystems where you know, worms and birds and not necessarily long-lived animals the way we think about primates, although he's gone that way as well. And what's important for him to think about a niche is that it's a process whereby organisms, through their metabolism and their activities, modify their own and each other's niche. A beaver dam is a very classic example, right? So a beaver makes a dam, and then the river is actually different, and it allows the beaver to work there. What I like is Jessica Flack in 2006, together with her husband David Krakow and others, they looked at primate behavior, and they suggested that maybe we should think also about social niche constructions. So primates spend a lot of time building relationships. And those relationships are not just for nothing. The relationships then change the environment in which you're making decisions. Some people call that experiential niche construction because you're changing the experience of how you then have the niche. You may not be changing it physically, but still, if you make a friend on the side and now you bring your friend into a group, then what you can negotiate now is very different. So I met Maria recently in the context of working with Delft, and I got invited to speak at this workshop. So that is maybe a form of social niche construction. So for me, when I started to spend time around human-robot interaction, I thought, well, and people like to talk about socio-technical complex systems, I thought, well, this can be extended to thinking about socio-technical niche construction. And the thing to think about, if you want to extend the idea of a niche to it, then thinking about living systems are as self-organizing or autopoietic systems. Usually you think about there's some organizational coherence to the system, but still it's energetically open. It exchanges matter with the world. And you can really think of structures and processes that co-constrain each other. So the structures are there to allow certain processes to happen, and the processes there create the structures. And as long as the structures and the processes are working, then the system is alive. So I want to think about this project that I've been involved in, this Ruby project, as a sense of niche construction. And I actually am thinking of it as 3 different niches, as I mentioned earlier. So the Ruby project is part of a research group. It was conceived in a research group. It had a very long history with a particular research site, Early Childhood Education Center. And then for 10 years, it was also part of a research network. And I thought it might be interesting to go through them in turn and just bring a few examples of maybe what I consider strong concepts in each, and to see what this dialectical relationship of niche construction is about. So just some background to the Ruby project. Ruby is actually an acronym that stands for Robot Using Bayesian Inference, and it was the brainchild of Javier Movillan, who had toddlers at the time and wanted to have a robot that would be very active in a classroom and wouldn't scare his kids. And that was kind of the background for it. And over the course of its life, it had maybe 3 different periods. You can read them kind of vertically. The period from 2004 to 2007 had Ruby 1 and Ruby 2, and these were mostly Wizard of Oz functioned in the classroom. And then Ruby 3 was still Wizard of Oz. By Ruby 4, it was autonomous. And it started to have certain functional capabilities like object detection. And then Ruby 5 and Ruby 6 was the period of time that I joined the project. One of the things that Javier liked to point out as he looked back at the project is this trade-off between robot autonomy and complexity. And he said that with Ruby 1, we actually worked with Kirio, that was a Japanese robot, at the same time that we had Ruby 1. One was very low in autonomy, so it was a Wizard of Oz, and low in complexity. And then to Ruby 2, we got greedy and got very complex and even less autonomous, and it was hard. Then we tried to get a little more compact and more organized and have it work better and move towards more autonomy. And then with Ruby 5, we got a little greedy again and tried to build a little bit more complex technology, and so far with Ruby 6. So this is just to give you some kind of just basic background to the Ruby project. So I want to go through the different niches, and I'll start with a research group. So it was part of Machine Perception Lab. And what kind of niche is Machine Perception Lab? It's extinct right now, so it doesn't exist anymore. It was machine perception, so it wasn't a robotics lab. And its main proponents were Javier Movillan and Marnie Bartlett and Gwen Littlewort. And their main effort was in automating facial expression recognition. Just around the time that I joined the lab, they started a startup called Emotion, where they redid their whole apparatus of automated facial expression recognition. And then they got bought by Apple. So they kind of were sucked out of academia and left kind of a big vacuum around behind them. But we managed to keep it going. But what's important to realize that the fact that they weren't a robotics lab, they basically got very involved in facial expression recognition. And Sony gave, at the time, they had the Aibo dog, and they gave that to Javier, and they were trying to get Aibo to be more usable by people, because people used to use it a little bit and then get rid of it. And what Machine Perception Lab did is they added gesture recognition through the facial expressions. And through recognizing that now that they had facial expressions and you could add it to a robotic agent, that kind of opened a whole bunch of things to do. And they went to play with humanoid robots by Hansen. So this is Einstein, and this is Diego-san, in which they also explored body movement. So this was also the production, so not just the reading of facial expression, but also producing them. And at the other end of the scale, from very expensive, very research platforms, they also wanted to have this robot that was in the classroom, immediately off-the-shelf components that would be more effective. So looking back at their work, some of the interesting work that I find, this is just an example of how they automated the facial expression and facial action recognition. By the time they put it in a robot, what they did is they called what they're doing, instead of thinking about, we're doing computer vision, they thought a bit more about providing perceptual primitives to a robot. So people talk about adding motor primitives. This was perceptual primitives, and everything from face detection to tracking and gaze following. You can get to a point where you can have person recognition. You can do the same thing. They had some auditory analysis, so they could do cry detection. They did some work with smell, mostly with smell production. They weren't really detecting smells, but producing them. Object detection, object recognition, and even the idea of maybe developing social touch as a perceptual primitive. So rather than thinking the way engineers would think, maybe I'm adding a haptic sensor, or I'm adding a camera, or I'm adding a Kinect sensor, thinking more about the functional work that gives. Adding perceptual primitives to a robot then also puts you in the realm of doing active perception, because the head could move, the hands could move, and that was a very productive concept. The idea of active perception was very strong with Eleanor Gibson and J.J. Gibson, because they always said, we don't just see, we actively look. So we actively move around the world to figure out what we want to do. So that was a very compelling way to think about now doing computational work with the robots. This is an example from Ruby 6 of using active object recognition. So because the robot could move its hands, what we did is the robot would grab an object. So before Ruby 6, the robot was able to detect an object because it had IR sensor in the grippers. But if we wanted to have conversation with the kids about the objects, we wanted to add object recognition to it. So this way, the robot would pick up an object and would twirl it in front of its chin. And in the chin, it had a camera. So now it had 70 images of the same object. And what Mohsen Malmir, the graduate student, did is, using deep learning, try to predict when you have a confusion between two, you have an image and you think it might be two different objects, what would be the next visual that you would get, or what would be the next action that you would take to disambiguate it. So this was an exciting way to get an opportunity where we would have real-time object recognition so that we could use it in conversations with the kids. We never actually got to the point where we did it in real time. We're still working on that, but the work to actually get the system going, to release a data set, and to do that kind of analysis was very helpful. This was the computational model that he used, and this was a little bit of how it worked. I won't stay with it too much, just because I think I want to get through some of the other things. If I think about then machine perception lab in terms of the, so if the idea of a niche construction is that when you do something, you change the niche and then you can do something else with the niche, what was important to realize is what Machine Perception Lab settled on was in this idea that we're always working with perceptual primitives. The kind of action and the way we understand action is that we really go in and immerse ourselves, and you'll see that a little bit later, what it means to do immersive design. And we're always interested in learning, both of the machine and the agents. Once you have this idea of what I called Ruby Pal, it means that a person who's just interested in touch can come into this research network, and someone who's just interested in learning can come in. So now you have a niche where a lot of different interests can come into the lab and get some interesting work going. And in fact, the Machine Perception Lab, aside from facial expression and developing this computational approach to Infomax, did a lot of projects with automated tutoring and had a variety of robots, both humanoid and more practical. This is the Ruby series here on the bottom. And the productivity is then shown in the kind of publications that they've done. But I want to shift now to thinking about Ruby as part of a research site, and what kind of niche is that research site. And we started at 2004 in the early childhood education center. That was actually where Javier's kids were going to school. And Catherine Owen is the director of this education center. And what's interesting about this education center is that when we started working with them, they were very hesitant about the use of technology in the classroom. Their philosophy about education is just social skills. They say if you teach kids good social skills, they took in kids from 3 months old to 6-year-old, they'll learn everything else they need because we're social animals, and that's the most important thing. So the stipulation of doing the work with bringing a robot into that classroom was that we were going to work with one classroom, and we were going to be beholden to what the teachers and the educators were doing, and they would actually determine how the robot is being used. Some of the interesting things that I consider as potential for strong concepts was that the model for how to have the interaction between the robot and the kids, in terms of when to, so the robot would do a give and take exchange with the kids. These are 1 to 2-year-old kids. They're not verbal yet, but so rather than talking, they like to give you objects and you give them objects. And if you're cool about giving them, then you're in their circle. But we didn't know exactly how to, what kind of affect to use and what kind of encouragement to give. So what we did is we put a stripped down version of the robot on the teacher's lap, and we just watched her and recorded her having very natural interactions with the kids. And then we actually built a computational model based on that behavior. So this idea that we can actually have this apprenticeship model of learning how to do natural interactions was very compelling. In earlier versions of Ruby, when we wanted to actually see what was going on with the kids, or with Ruby 4, we had to record what was going on in the classroom, and then we had to do video analysis by hand. And if anyone has done video analysis—
Sorry, Deborah,
yeah?
I interrupt 1 second. We have
how many
6
minutes?
more minutes also
okay.
For the question. Okay.
Just to, so I'll try to move a little more quickly. So by the time we were able to do person recognition, we were able to do what we called home alone. We were able to leave the robot in the classroom. It was autonomous. The robot recorded not only what was going on, but who the kids were. And what was very exciting was that we were also able to see when 2 kids were in front of the robot at the same time, and start to build not a sociogram, but a Rubygram. At this point, the teachers were much more excited, because this meant that they could have a view onto the classroom that they really liked. So this idea that the teachers now could help drive the research and could think about the robot in terms of the kind of curriculum that they would want to do. And then the robot would give us the socio-emotional data that they're analyzing, and we'd be able to give assessments to the teachers more quickly, and the teachers would be able to use that to interact with the parents. That kind of model started to feel very, very compelling. And that niche now, the Early Childhood Education Center, is very open to working with robots. This is retirement party for Lydia Morrison, who's worked there from 2004. These are all kids that were 2-year-olds when Ruby projects first started, and they came back to look at the current Rubies. But I wanted to also give a little bit of attention to a research network that developed for 10 years between 2000, I think it started in 2006, I think. And it was called the Temporal Dynamics of Learning. And this niche was actually a pretty complex niche that was built as a network of networks. There were 40 PIs, 3 different countries, a lot of universities, and basically we were trying to invent a new field, which is the temporal dynamics of learning. And we were interested in the temporal dynamics of the world, how they're in action in the brain and in learning. And just some of the most interesting things that happened around there, because there was Janet Wiles built a robot rat in the context of thinking of how the hippocampus does navigation. Now in the network, there was also Andrea Chiba, who had real rats. And they thought, well, maybe let's bring the robot rat with the real rats, just the way we had Ruby with the kids. And what this allowed us to do was to ask, in both cases, the rats know that it's not a real rat, and the kids know that Ruby is not a real human. And yet there's something about the social engagement that allows learning to happen. So this idea that you can start to ask similar questions across species was very interesting. And what they were able to show with the robot rat, that actually the real rats could learn some behavior from some pro-social behavior from the robot rats and engage that way. And what was even more interesting is that once we were able to do that, when the Australian group who built AiRat went into developing kid-friendly robots, we got them to do a parallel project to Ruby. But even before that, there were some other people in the science of learning networks that were willing to try to engage Ruby with some other research questions and curriculum and ways to engage. And this is, again, this Janet Wiles, the Australian group that built the AiRat. They started a project called OPI, and they used it a lot with Aborigine groups to help to preserve languages. And one of their graduate students came back to San Diego and actually used Ruby 6 in an imitation robotic sense. So what I wanted to show you is that thinking about niche construction and thinking that niches are not mutually exclusive, that's an interesting way to revisit a whole body of work and start to see what kinds of things can cut across within a particular site, within a particular group, and even across a research network. I think that you don't need the labels in order for good things to happen. I think if you looked at your own projects now, you would discover a lot of the similar things. But it is a curious way to consider what happens if you make these deliberate engagements. What can you do? So these are some of the people that were in the different groups, and that's kind of my smorgasbord. I hope there's a couple of minutes for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deborah. Very interesting. And if there is some question from the audience, they are more than welcome. You can also write in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom.
Maybe I'll ask a quick question. First of all, great to see you again, Deborah.
Yes, good to see you.
Always interesting to hear your thoughts. So what do you think of a good example is of really the organism altering the ecosystem, which then goes back to alter the organism in the case of the niches you were discussing?
So what we've seen in Ruby in the Early Childhood Education Center is once it was in the room with the kids all the time, we never structured, we never forced kids to interact with Ruby. So the kids would go and interact whenever they want, or the teachers worked it into a way that they engage. So for instance, in the morning after they change the kids' diapers, there's usually one adult caregiver, and there's more of a free kind of a play association. And what we started to see is that the teacher would ask a few questions of the kids, and then they would also include Ruby, and they would say, hey, what about Ruby's colors? Or what about Ruby's shoes? Or what about Ruby's things? And that started to create opportunities for learning that were not there before the robot was in the room with them. But it was done in this kind of organic way. The other thing that we noticed is that by the time we came around to Ruby 5 or 6, the face of the robot was an iPad. And the first time we brought Ruby 5 to the classroom, and I don't know what part of the dialectic that is, but one of the kids walked over to Ruby's face and tapped twice and then swiped sideways. Now, 10 years ago, no kid would go to a robot and make that motion, but somehow in the niches that kids engage now with screens and with the motion of swiping things, that became a way to engage a robot. So I think, I don't know, it's hard to just put clear lines like that, but you see this constant kind of back and forth So teachers can now think of different ways of using it. And we had to think about a way of getting the kids not to poke the eyes of the robot. So we had to change a little bit how the robot interacts with the kids. And then the kids had to learn something about it, and they changed the way they learn. So those are maybe some examples.
Thanks.
Make it yourself. Otherwise, I can read it. I can. So Elena is thanking you for your talk. I read Morana Alak's paper, When a Robot is Social. And you seem to offer a complementary view on the organizational level.
Yes, Morana Alak worked with this, with the Ruby project. And she's a very serious ethnographer. And she's also the one who decided to try a smell aspect for Ruby and add a smell component. I think she delved very deeply into, and she's a semiotician, so very much into the meaning making of the engagement of gestures and how kids make meaning. And I'm slightly more behavioral ecology. And also my orientation in the project was more in how to help the designers in their process of design. So I don't know if that helps you orient the complementary parts of Morana versus my perspective on Ruby project.